I've got a stack of papers in front of me today that, honestly, it feels a little heavy.
Like physically heavy or?
Oh, both. Physically heavy for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking court transcripts, old electoral maps, census data from the 1870s, but also historically heavy.
Right.
Because we usually have this nice, clean narrative about American history. The Civil War ends, the good guys win, slavery is abolished, and then we just sort of fast forward to Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, the mission accomplished version of history. It's comforting, but it leaves out about 100 years of details.
And those details are what we're digging into for this deep dive. Because when you actually look at the statutes and the voting records, which is our mission today, you realize that 1865 didn't solve the conflict over race in America.
Not at all.
It just changed the battlefield.
Yeah.
We moved from a war over ownership to a war over citizenship.
Precisely. The central question shifted from, can you own a human being, to does that human being have the same political power as a white person?
Right.
And the answer to that question involved terror, legal loopholes, and a political map that looks completely upside down compared to what you see today.
That's the part that always trips people up. We're going to be talking about a time when the Solid South was deep blue Democrat and the champions of federal intervention were Republicans.
It's disorienting for a lot of people.
It really is. We need to unpack how that racial hierarchy was built, who built it, and then the big controversy, the so-called party switch. Did everyone just swap jerseys in the 1960s?
It is probably the most debated topic in American political history.
Yeah.
And usually people just yell talking points at each other.
Exactly.
But I want us to look at the actual roster of senators and the election returns, because the data tells a much more complex story than, everyone switched sides on a Tuesday.
So let's get into the sources. We start with the aftermath of the war. The Union wins. We get the big three amendments.
The Reconstruction amendments. The 13th ends slavery. The 14th is the big one for our purposes. It establishes citizenship and equal protection under the law. And then the 15th says you can't deny the right to vote based on race.
Which, on paper, sounds like a total victory. You have formerly enslaved men voting, holding office. I was looking at the data, and Mississippi actually sent 2 black senators to Washington in the 1870s.
Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. It was an absolute revolution. But you understand the reaction. This wasn't just, oh, we lost an election.
Right. It was deeper than that.
Much deeper. This was a total inversion of the social order in the South, and the backlash was immediate. This is where the Ku Klux Klan enters the picture.
And I want to pause on the Klan because I think we have this pop culture image of them as just these guys in sheets burning crosses. But looking at the reports from 1866 and 1867, this wasn't just some secret society or hate club.
No, and that is a crucial distinction. It started in late 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, founded by 6 former Confederate officers. And it quickly morphed into what military historians would call a paramilitary insurgency. They weren't just trying to scare people with theatrics. They had a very specific political objective, which was to overthrow the Reconstruction governments and restore the Democratic Party to power in the South.
So they were basically the armed wing of a political faction.
Exactly. They targeted black voters, obviously, but they also targeted scalawags, white Southerners who voted Republican. The Klan was assassinating local leaders, burning schools. It was terrorism with a clear ballot box goal.
But this is where the history books usually get fuzzy, right? They say the Klan rose, but they rarely mention that the federal government actually fought back. I was honestly surprised to see how aggressive President Grant was.
This was one of the things that really jumped out at me in the source notes, the role of Ulysses S. Grant. We all think of him as the general, on the $50 bill, but his presidency was, it was incredibly aggressive regarding civil rights.
Aggressive is definitely the right word there. If you look at the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, this was not small government conservatism. Grant used the full weight of the federal government to crush the Ku Klux Klan.
Ulysses S. Grant is fascinating here. We're in the early 1870s now. Grant realizes that local courts aren't going to convict Klansmen because the juries are either terrified or complicit.
Yeah, they live in the same towns.
Right. So he pushes for the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871.
And the text of that act is wild. It basically gave the president the power to treat domestic terror like a full-blown rebellion.
He actually suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 9 counties in South Carolina.
Okay, for those of us who aren't constitutional lawyers, can we clarify what suspending habeas corpus actually means in practice? Because that sounds like a massive deal.
It is a massive deal. It means the military can arrest you and hold you without bringing you before a judge. You don't get a trial immediately.
Hmm.
Grant used the military to round up thousands of suspected Klan members,
Just sweeping them up.
sweeping them up,
Yeah.
and it broke the back of the first Klan. By 1872 or 1873, the organization was effectively dismantled. It was the strongest federal civil rights enforcement of the 19th century.
So the federal government proved it could stop the violence if it wanted to. But we know how the story ends. We get Jim Crow. So what happened? Did the North just give up?
Politics happened. The North got tired of occupying the South. There was a massive economic panic in 1873, and voters started caring a lot more about their wallets than about civil rights. It all culminated in the Compromise of 1877.
That's a shady backroom deal we always hear about.
It was a complete mess. The presidential election was fiercely disputed, and to get the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, into the White House, the Republicans agreed to pull the remaining federal troops out of the South.
And once the troops leave, the Redeemer governments take over. And to be crystal clear based on the documents, when the sources say Redeemer governments, they are talking specifically about the Democratic Party.
Exclusively. This is the beginning of the Solid South. From the 1870s to the mid-1900s, the Democratic Party has a stranglehold on every level of power in the South. Governors, judges, sheriffs, everything.
But without the Klan running around, how did they stop black people from voting? Because the 15th Amendment was still on the books. You can't just pass a law saying black people can't vote.
No, you can't. So they had to get creative. They moved from night raids to what I call legalistic insurgency. They wrote laws that were technically race-neutral on paper, but explicitly designed to target black voters.
The Jim Crow playbook.
Exactly. You get sharecropping for economic control. You get poll taxes to make voting too expensive. But the absolute masterclass in this was the Mississippi Constitution of 1890.
I was reading about this in the source material. It is almost diabolical. They came up with something called the Understanding Clause.
Right. So you introduce a literacy test to vote, but plenty of poor white voters couldn't read either, and the Democrats didn't want to disenfranchise them. So the law said you have to be able to read a section of the Constitution or be able to understand it when read to you and give a reasonable interpretation.
Reasonable interpretation. That sounds incredibly subjective.
That is the trap. A white registrar is sitting behind the desk, and a literate white man comes in. The registrar reads a simple one-line sentence. The guy nods, and the registrar says he understands. Registered. Then a black man comes in, maybe a university graduate, and the registrar reads a complex, arcane legal article and asks for a rigorous constitutional analysis. No matter what he says, the registrar just says, nope, you don't understand it. Request denied.
So the law essentially deputized every local registrar as a dictator of who gets to vote.
And it worked flawlessly for them. In Louisiana, for example, there were about 130,000 registered black voters in 1896. By 1904, after these new laws, there were barely 1,300.
Wow. From 130,000 down to 1,300.
It wasn't a decline, it was an erasure.
Where's the Supreme Court in all this?
Enabling it. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 and the civil rights cases of 1883, the courts severely narrowed the 14th Amendment and struck down early civil rights acts. And then, of course, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
Separate but equal.
Yes. That ruling provided the impenetrable legal shield for Jim Crow for nearly 60 years.
They viewed themselves as redeeming the South from quote-unquote black rule and Northern interference. And once they had that control back, they didn't let go for 100 years.
They built the Solid South.
Right, and when historians say solid, they mean it literally. The South became a one-party state under the Democratic Party.
And I think this is where a lot of the modern confusion starts to creep in for us. Because we learned about Jim Crow in school as this abstract, evil system, but we often detach it from the actual party label that was running it.
We do. We tend to say things like, the South did this, or the South passed these laws, but politically speaking, the South was the Democratic Party. If you were a sheriff in Alabama in 1920, you were a Democrat. If you were the judge sentencing a black man to a chain gang, you were a Democrat. The Republican Party in the South during this era was basically non-existent. It was a ghost.
Okay, so the lines are pretty clearly drawn at this point.
Yeah.
You have Republicans in the North, segregationist Democrats in the South. But then we hit the mid-20th century, and the source notes here get really interesting because those clean lines start to blur.
The 1950s. This is the era that completely disrupts that clean narrative we were talking about. You have a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. Now, he's not considered a radical by any means, but look at who he appoints to the Supreme Court, Earl Warren.
The man who wrote the unanimous decision for Brown v. Board of Education, ending school segregation.
Right, a Republican appointee. And when the Democratic governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, decides he's going to literally defy the Supreme Court and use state troops to keep black kids out of Little Rock Central High, what does Eisenhower do?
He sends in the 101st Airborne.
He federalizes the National Guard. You have a Republican president using the United States military to force a Democratic governor to integrate public schools.
Yeah, if you're trying to stick to the narrative that Republicans have always been the bad guys on race since the end of Reconstruction, 1957 is a real awkward year for you.
It definitely complicates things. And it sets up the massive legislative battles of the 1960s. We usually associate the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with LBJ Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat.
And he signed it. He pushed incredibly hard for it.
He did. LBJ deserves massive credit for twisting arms and spending political capital to get that passed. But if you look at the actual vote breakdown in Congress, it tells a very different story about the parties.
I have the numbers right here in the research packet. In the House of Representatives, 61% of Democrats voted for the Civil Rights Act, but 80% of Republicans voted for it.
Think about that. The party of Lincoln was actually more supportive of the bill, percentage-wise, than the Democrats were.
So why is the popular narrative that the parties were completely polarized on this specific issue?
Because the opposition wasn't actually partisan, it was regional. The no votes were almost exclusively Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats and the Northern Republicans were mostly on the exact same side. The split was North versus South.
Okay, so we've arrived at 1964. The Civil Rights Act passes. Goldwater opposes it. LBJ signs it. And the legend says that LBJ turned to an aide that night and said, "We have lost the South for a generation."
A very prophetic quote.
But this is where we really get to the core of the switch. The common belief out there is that all the racist Southern Democrats got angry, left the party in a huff, and became Republicans overnight.
That is the party switch myth right there. And we need to be very precise about this. Did the voters eventually realign? Yes. Did the politicians switch parties? No.
Wait, really? Because I feel like I've always heard that the segregationists just walked across the aisle.
There was almost no mass exodus of office holders. Let's look at the absolute titans of the Jim Crow South. Men like James Eastland of Mississippi, John Stennis, Richard Russell. These guys were the arch segregationists. They literally filibustered the Civil Rights Act. Did they become Republicans?
Well, I'm looking at the historical list here, and no, they stayed Democrats until they died.
Exactly. They stayed in the Democratic Party and fought to keep their seniority and their powerful committee chairmanships. They didn't defect.
But there was one big one, right? Strom Thurmond.
Strom Thurmond is the exception that proves the rule. He switched to the GOP in 1964, and because he was so famous and frankly so loud, people assume everyone did it. But he was practically alone in doing that. The vast majority of the Southern Democratic machinery stayed exactly where it was.
So if the politicians didn't switch, how on earth did the South become Republican? Because today, you look at a map of Alabama or Mississippi, and it is deep, deep red.
It was a voter realignment, and it was agonizingly slow. It didn't happen in a single election cycle. It took 30 years.
30 years.
Think about the yellow dog Democrats. These were Southerners who proudly said they would vote for a yellow dog before they would ever vote for a Republican. That deep cultural habit didn't just vanish in 1964.
So how did the dam finally break?
Well, the presidency went first. Goldwater won the Deep South in '64. Nixon did very well there. But down ballot, sheriffs, mayors, state legislators, congressmen, the South stayed overwhelmingly Democrat well into the 80s and even the 90s.
Wow, I really didn't realize the lag was that significant.
It was huge. The Republicans didn't actually capture the majority of House seats in the South until the Republican Revolution of 1994. That is a 30-year lag between the Civil Rights Act and the GOP actually controlling Southern politics.
So it wasn't a sudden switch at all. It was a slow bleed.
It was a generational replacement. The old diehard Democrats didn't necessarily change their minds. They died. And their children and grandchildren who were growing up in a completely different world started voting Republican.
Which brings us nicely to the Southern strategy. The conventional wisdom is that Nixon and the GOP looked at the racist vote in the South, said, "We want that," and built a strategy entirely around courting white grievance.
Right. That's the standard narrative you'll hear. The Republicans became the racist party to win the South. But the Claremont analysis, which draws heavily on work by scholars like Gerard Alexander, argues that this narrative gets the geography completely wrong.
How so?
Yeah.
I mean, if the strategy was to court racists, wouldn't you win the most racist areas?
Exactly. If the GOP rise was driven purely by segregationists jumping ship, you would expect the Republicans to win the Deep South first. The places where George Wallace was a hero, Alabama, Mississippi, rural Georgia.
And what does the data actually say?
The electoral data shows the exact opposite. The Republicans actually rose first in what political scientists call the peripheral South.
You have to define that for us.
We're talking about states like Virginia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina. These were the areas that were rapidly modernizing. They had air conditioning, bringing in huge numbers of transplants from the North and Midwest. They had booming suburbs. They had a rising educated middle class.
So the argument is that the GOP wasn't winning because of Jim Crow nostalgia, but because of suburbia.
Economic conservatism, anti-communism, national defense, religious values. The Claremont argument is that the voters moving to the GOP weren't the old Klan members. They were the new suburbanites. In fact, the Deep South, the hardcore segregationist base, actually resisted the Republican Party the longest.
Wait, so the most historically racist parts of the South stayed Democrat the longest?
Correct. They stuck with Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton long after the booming suburbs in Florida and Texas had flipped to Reagan.
That is a crucial distinction. It suggests the realignment wasn't just racists moving from left to right. It was that the South itself fundamentally changed.
Precisely. The South became less rural, more suburban, and much more economically dynamic. The claim here is that the GOP became the dominant party in the South during the region's least racist phase in its history, driven by economic development and migration, not by some sudden desire to bring back the poll tax.
That definitely adds a huge layer of complexity to this.
Yeah.
It makes it a much less of a neat moral fable and much more of a demographic study.
Which is usually where the truth lives in history.
But look, we cannot talk about the Democratic Party's history with race without talking about the elephant, or maybe I should say the donkey, in the room, Robert Byrd.
Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia.
He is the living embodiment of the Democratic Party's tortured history with race.
I mean, the facts in his biography are pretty stark. In the early 1940s, he wasn't just a casual member of the KKK. He was an active recruiter. He actually held the title of Exalted Cyclops.
Which sounds ridiculous to modern ears, but it was deadly serious. It meant he was the leader, the chapter president. He was organizing the hate. And he carried that segregationist ideology straight into the U.S. Senate. He filibustered the 1964 Civil Rights Act for 14 straight hours.
Just standing there reading the phone book or whatever to stop the vote. For those who don't know the mechanics, a filibuster isn't just giving a long speech, it's a weapon.
It's a procedural blockade. In the Senate, you need a supermajority to stop debate and actually vote on a bill. If you don't get those votes, the debate goes on forever and the bill dies. Byrd and his Southern Democratic colleagues were using the rules of the Senate to strangle civil rights legislation.
Yes, Robert Byrd is the ultimate case study for why this history hurts our brains.
But just for listeners who might not know the full biography here, Robert Byrd was a senator from West Virginia for over 50 years. He was the Democratic Senate Majority Leader. He was an absolute institution in Washington.
He was known as Mr. Democrat. And in the 1940s, he wasn't just a casual member of the Ku Klux Klan, he was a recruiter.
The source notes specifically say he held the title of Exalted Cyclops.
Yes. He led a local chapter. He wrote letters that were incredibly virulently racist. We aren't talking about someone who just attended a meeting once to network. He was a dedicated organizer.
But then he stays in the Senate for decades.
Yeah.
And he completely reinvents himself over time.
He did. He eventually renounced the Klan. He called it the greatest mistake of his life. He said he was young and foolish, though, to be fair, he was in his late 20s, so young is a bit relative. But later in his career, he actually had a 100% rating from the NAACP. He voted for the extension of the Voting Rights Act.
And when he died in 2010, the public reaction was fascinating.
The NAACP released an official statement mourning him. Barack Obama delivered a eulogy for him.
That is just mind-blowing when you step back and think about it. Imagine if a powerful Republican senator was revealed to be a former Exalted Cyclops of the Klan.
He would be incinerated by the media in about 5 minutes. And this is exactly where the double standard argument comes in from conservative critics. They say, look, the Democratic Party just whitewashed his history because he was powerful and useful to them.
But his defenders would say, no, he proves that genuine redemption is possible.
And honestly, both things can be true. The Democratic Party of 1940 was a vessel that could comfortably hold an active Klansman. The Democratic Party of 2008 was a vessel that elected the first black president. And Robert Byrd managed to stay on that exact same boat the entire time as it changed course.
So if we zoom out and try to synthesize all of this for you listening right now, we basically have to hold two really contradictory ideas in our heads at the exact same time.
We do. Truth number one is that the Democratic Party was the political vehicle for white supremacy and Jim Crow for a solid century. That is simply a historical fact. The party built the statues, it enforced the segregation laws, it aggressively defended the quote-unquote Southern way of life.
And truth number two.
Truth number two is that a massive political realignment did occur. The South absolutely became Republican, but it wasn't because the racist leaders just swapped jerseys in a smoky back room in 1964. It was a slow, agonizing process of demographic change, economic shifts, and older voters dying off and being replaced by new generations with entirely different priorities.
It's almost unsatisfying, isn't it? We really just want a clean story.
History rarely gives us clean stories, it gives us mess.
Well, on that existential note, we are going to leave you to ponder the shifting sands of American political identity. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the messy, complicated history of American politics.
Always good to look closely at the record.
See you next time.